I'm Ali Isfandiari, the director of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. We are delighted to have with us today David Ottaway, who is a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a former bureau chief of the Washington Post in Cairo. For those of you who didn't get a chance to pick up his latest writing for us, Egypt at the Tipping Point, there are copies outside. Please do help yourself. David has spent most of his professional life as a foreign correspondent, national security, and investigative reporter for the Washington Post. He is also the author of several books, including the most recently, The King's Messenger, Prince Bandar bin Sultan and America's Tangled Relationship with Saudi Arabia. And he's currently working on a book that is taking him back to 6 countries where he lived or covered major stories, including Egypt. David is a graduate of Harvard, and he holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. Today, he's going to speak about the current crisis in the Arab world's aging leadership. Just for fun, I was this morning adding up the ages of the current Arab kings and presidents, and it came to almost 600. So these people have been around for almost 6 centuries and in office for 2 centuries. So David, you tell us what we should expect. Would they live forever or not?
Well, Hala, thank you for the introduction. I put together this chart. It's not possible to deal with all those case studies, but there are a couple observations I wanted to make about this chart. When I saw that Qaboos and Muammar Gaddafi have been in power 40 years or more, I started thinking about, how does that rank with other non-royals or even royals around the world in terms of longevity? And as regards non-royals, if you put aside the constitutional monarchs like Queen Elizabeth, I found only one leader, Fidel Castro, who's alive today, who has been in power longer than 40 years. If you take Castro's end of his power when he temporarily resigned in 2006, he would have been in power 47 years. He's now no longer in power. He's given power to his brother. So we have 2, Sultan Qaboos and Gaddafi, one 70, the other 68. They have a good chance. They're not. I don't think there's anybody thinking they're about to be overthrown. You have a good chance of at least 2 Arab leaders equaling or maybe even surpassing Fidel Castro as the longest non-royal leaders in the world. There are a couple of things here I wanted. So I think it's really interesting. Why is it the Arab world is producing all these, long-time survivors and been in power for 30, 40 years? And we can't. It's not possible because there are different explanations in each country. So this is not the time for generalization. We're trying to deal with the succession issues and what's likely to happen in some of these countries. I do want to point out 2 signs of the times, if you will, that have been happening in the last few days and weeks. One is in Yemen, where President Ali Saleh has introduced legislation into the parliament that will change the constitution and allow him to become president for life. This started on January 1, so it's very timely. And I'm sure he will change the Constitution so he can become president for life. The other sort of personal experience of, presidents that have been around forever. I was in Algiers for a conference in the middle of December, 2.5 weeks ago. And it was a rather important conference. It dealt with the celebration, 50th anniversary of the sort of acceleration of the independence of African countries. And there were 4 former presidents, African presidents, who had played a big role in this there, and the head of the OU, and Amr Musser from the Arab League. And it was really a big event. And one person was absent. The president of Algeria, Abdulaziz Bouteflika. Now, he has formally only been in power for the last 11 years, but Abdulaziz Bouteflika is kind of part of my life, because when I started as a foreign correspondent, it was back in Algiers in 1962, when it was becoming independent, and Bouteflika was the second foreign minister. He became foreign minister in 1963. And he has been around Algerian politics as a representative of kind of the generation that fought France and is still in power today. He's very much a representative of that generation. And I asked people, Algerian journalists, why isn't Bouteflika here? The number one assumption they gave me is that he's very sick. And if the leaks from cables that we've been reading about over the last 3 weeks, some of them are from Algiers, and the American embassy, anyway, seems to think he's got cancer of the stomach. And I was told he had just been to Germany. He goes to France and Germany on these secret trips that everybody seems to believe are tied to treatment for cancer. How long he'll last, nobody seems to know. But he's very much absent, and it really struck me, what it's like living in an Arab country today where you have a sick and dying leader and nobody is there to... He never has press conferences. He hardly goes out into the public. He's there, but he's not there. And it's kind of a sad end to his career and puts Algeria in a very difficult situation. Of course, he's trying to now manipulate so that his brother will take over, Said Bouteflika, but who knows whether that's going to happen. The other sign of the times, as we meet here today, is what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt. Tunisia, for the first time in many years, has been having riots that were sparked by the suicide of a university graduate who burned himself to death. He actually just died yesterday, but he set himself on fire in the middle of December in protest over the lack of jobs for young Tunisians, or he's 26 years old, but that age group that just can't find jobs. This sparked off riots, and they continued for at least a week. They seem to have calmed down now, but you can see the kind of thing that is boiling just below the surface in many Arab countries. And of course, not below the surface, but right out in broad daylight is the sectarian strife taking place in Egypt today between Muslims and Copts. There are about 20, the death toll in a bombing of a church in Alexandria is now up to 23. And this happened, was it Christmas Eve? This sparked a number of riots that continue today. Things are very tense between the two communities there. And it's the kind of tension that I remember, because I was there when Sadat was assassinated. It's the kind of tensions in the months leading up to Sadat's assassination that kind of set the scene for trouble in Algeria, and finally the assassination of Anwar Sadat. And I'm not predicting Mubarak's about to be assassinated, but I'm just saying it's the tensions that are building up in that society, very much connected to the succession issue. Now, as we think about succession and what we should worry about, I was struck by a report from the Reuters news agency that came out with a report on December 21st, picking its top global political risks trends for 2011. Number 2 on their list, after the competition between China and the United States and the problems that may arise from that, was what it called countries of old men. And it said, watch for disturbances in countries with elderly rulers and no visible succession plan. And its first 2 case studies or examples they mentioned were Egypt and Saudi Arabia, both of which I'll talk about in greater detail later on. So I'm thinking about what are the risks of succession? What should we think about in these succession issues? I think there are at least 3 assumptions we should sort of rethink. The first is that old leaders are always sort of stuck in their ways and incapable of political or other reform. That somehow age equals mental sclerosis and inaction. Another is that younger leaders, these guys here, new generation leaders, are likely to be more interested in modernization and opening up their political systems because they're better educated and sort of more attuned to the times. And the third assumption is that succession is necessarily going to touch off disturbances or provoke instability, which is what Reuters is predicting for 2011 in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. As regard the first rethink, I don't think we should automatically assume that longevity in age or time in power necessarily means we're dealing with stagnant or reactionary regimes. There are indeed examples of that, but I want to give you 2 examples to make us rethink where the leaders in power at the end of their lives, Arab leaders I'm talking about, have really been quite dynamic and reform-minded. The first one was King Hassan of Morocco. A few years before he died in 1999, after ruling for 38 years, Hassan introduced a practice of allowing opposition parties who actually did pretty well in elections to come form the government. And in 1997, he allowed the Socialist Party, which won the plurality of votes, not the majority, to come into the government, to lead the formation of it, and he invited the socialist leader Abdurrahman Youssoufi to come back from exile and become the prime minister of the country. Now, this is really extraordinary. I can't imagine this happening today in any other Arab country. He also allowed King Hassan, before he died, he allowed the Islamists to begin forming their own political party, legal political party, and participating in the political system. And he began addressing the human rights abuses for which he had become famous or infamous during his rule. Example 2, this time a living example, is King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. He was de facto ruler starting in 1995 when the former king, King Fahd, had a stroke. And then he took over when Fahd, 2005 when Fahd died. So he was kind of running the country for 15 years. Well, as things go in Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah is beginning to look pretty good as a reform-minded person. In the past decade, he's held the country's first nationwide municipal elections. He launched a national dialogue that forced the kingdom's sort of feuding religious sects to sit down and discuss their differences. He's convoked women, youth, and professionals also into this national dialogue in different sessions to discuss their problems and the country's problems. He's cracked down on the excesses of the Wahhabi morality police that go around beating up people if they're not in the mosque 5 times a day. He launched an international dialogue among the world's various faiths. He brought Saudi Arabia into the World Trade Organization after years of internal debate and opposition to it within his own country. He set up the first integrated, i.e. integrated men and women, university in Saudi Arabia. He fired a number of really reactionary Wahhabi religious leaders. He's appointed moderates as education and justice ministers. He's appointed the first female in any Saudi government as a deputy education minister. He's really become very popular at home. And I think he's going to emerge as probably one of the best kings Saudi Arabia has had in contemporary history. Now, time will tell whether his reforms flower, but he's at least sown the seeds for some kind of change in a society that, as I say, gives new meaning to moving at a snail's pace. But my conclusion, the point I'm trying to make here is age may be less important than character, vision, grit, and courage. The second rethink regards these young new leaders. We assumed when they came to power a decade ago that they would be more reform-minded and things would begin to change. And I'm talking about Syria, Morocco, and Jordan. Well, let's look at what are the lessons learned from the so-called change in generation that occurred in those countries right around 1999-2000. They raised great expectations for serious reform when they first came into power. But you have to, I think anybody who looks at their record, you have to conclude it's very mixed and somewhat disappointing. King Abdullah of Jordan, he's 48 years old now, and he's been in power since 1999. I mean, he was kind of a poster boy of the modernizing king, if you will. I mean, he went to Deerfield Academy in Massachusetts, the high school, and then in Oxford and Georgetown. And when he came into power, shortly after he came into power, he put Marwan Muasher, who had been his foreign minister, in charge of drawing up a serious reform agenda. This started in 2005, in the 2006 period. What were the results? It was defeated by the country's conservative forces, which Abdullah would not buck or take on, and Muasher basically voted with his feet. He left the government in 2007. He went to the World Bank, and then he's now at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Massachusetts Avenue. Today, King Abdullah II seems mostly concerned about how to contain the Islamic Action Front. And he's been progressively closing down media freedom, particularly cyberspace, websites, newspapers on the website, trying to get more control over the media. Bashar Al Assad, 45 years old today, in power since June 2000, when his father died, educated in England to become an ophthalmologist, not sort of clean hands when he came into politics. Initially, he was slightly more liberal and open, allowed some dissent, but it was very short-lived. And, I mean, I think the Human Rights Watch report in July July last year, sort of looking at 10 years of Bashar's rule, is basically correct. The Damascus spring that followed al-Assad's ascent to power, during which a number of informal groups began meeting in private homes to discuss political reform, was a short-lived experiment. Its high point was the shutting down of Mazza prison in November 2000 and the release of hundreds of political prisoners shortly thereafter. It came to an abrupt end in August 2001. Syria's prisons are filled again with political prisoners, journalists, and human rights activists. And they go on to give a list of 92 political and human rights activists detained since he came to power. King Mohamed VI in Morocco, 47 years old now, and he's in power since 1999. He began as he continued his father's reform. He organized a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to look into killings and abuses of human rights under his father, and actually gave out some compensation to people to families who had lost whose family members had been killed during Hassan's rule. So I was really quite hopeful. Everything I've read or heard about since in the last couple of years is that the time of reform is ended, that there is no movement towards giving up any of the king's powers to the political parties, and it's kind of stuck at this point. So I'm saying we should not expect any longer that new generation Arab leaders will necessarily undertake serious or permanent reforms. Youth is not necessarily the key. Foreign education in the best schools of France and the United States is not necessarily going to produce reform leaders. And in all of these countries, they've basically fallen back. They've tightened control of their rule, fallen back on massive security systems to stay in power. So, having discussed these two of the assumptions I talked about, I want to look at Saudi Arabia and Egypt regarding the succession issue. And I'm keeping in mind what Reuters warning about troubles ahead in these two countries. Watch for disturbances in countries with elderly rulers and no visible succession plan. Let's start with Saudi Arabia. Ever since King Abdulaziz founded modern-day Saudi Arabia in 1932, there has been a de facto succession plan, which has consisted of one of his sons taking over, and then another son, either a half-brother or a full brother, taking over. And that's the way the system has run. That's been the succession plan. The current king, in 2006, kind of set out to, basically, in terms of how things work in Saudi Arabia, revolutionize the system of how the next crown prince and king were chosen. He set up, or decreed, what's called an allegiance council, or an allegiance commission, that consists of 16 living sons of King Abdulaziz, the founder of the present-day Saudi Arabia, and 19 of his grandsons. So you have a council of 35 princes thinking about who should be the next crown prince and therefore the next king. Now, in theory, this council actually has quite a bit of power. The king can propose 1, 2, or 3 candidates to become the next crown prince, and the commission is empowered, in theory, to choose one of the 3, or if the king only names one, they can either approve it, or they're empowered to to nominate whom it, being the council, thinks would be suitable to become crown prince if they do not agree on the king's choice. Now, in theory, that is a huge change for for king-making in Saudi Arabia. So is this, in fact, how it's going to happen? Well, in May 2009, Abdullah put the whole process in question himself by naming Prince Nayef, his Minister of Interior and half-brother, as his second deputy prime minister. This certainly gave the impression to outsiders and most Saudis that the king was anointing Prince Nayef as the next person after the crown prince today is Crown Prince Sultan, who's the first deputy prime minister. Now Nayef is the second deputy prime minister, so he's kind of second in line to become king. But nothing is simple or clear in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi watchers have noted that Abdullah did not make Nayef deputy crown prince, which would make it very clear that he wants Nayef to become the next king after Sultan. So the question is Nayef going to become the king after Sultan or not? And because Sultan has been struggling with cancer for the last 2 years and is really seriously sick, it's very possible that Nayef could become the king very soon. And there are good reasons why he might become. He's arguably the third ranking person in the royal family. He's been interior minister since 1975. He's got strong support from the conservative Wahhabi establishment. He's been given credit for the crackdown on Al-Qaeda since 2003 that basically has wiped Al-Qaeda out of Saudi Arabia as a threat to the royal family or the country. But there remains doubt about whether Nayef will make it or not. Now, will there be disturbances, as we've been asked to expect? I think in the case of Saudi Arabia, the only disturbances we're going to see is going to be confined to within the royal family, and unlikely to spill over the confines of the Allegiance Council. That's the council set up to decide the next crown prince. We may see some critical remarks about the whole process from princes that are outside of the council, outside of the power circle of Saudi Arabia. I wouldn't be surprised if people like Prince Al-Walid, who's billionaire, Saudi Arabia's leading billionaire, will make some comments or disagree on how the process goes forward. But I don't think we're going to see disturbances, certainly not in the street. And I don't think we're going to see a transition right away to the new generation of leaders in Saudi Arabia, that is the grandsons of King Abdulaziz, because there are still several of King Abdulaziz's sons who are in very prominent positions today, who very likely could become the next crown prince if Nayef is not chosen. Now, on to Egypt. Totally different story. Just to remind you, Mubarak's been there since 1981. And the next presidential election is this coming September. He has already had the constitution changed so that he can run again. In fact, he can stay there for life. Question is, will he? He's 82. He's been in declining health for several years. Last year, he underwent surgery to remove his gallbladder. And for the last couple of years, Egyptians have acted as though he could pass away at any time, any moment. Mubarak has never named a vice president, although he himself was vice president to Anwar Sadat, and Sadat was vice president to Gamal Abdel Nasser. So there had been a tradition of having a vice president who then took over. Mubarak never has done this. But still, there is this presumed succession scenario, which is namely the passage of power from Mubarak Sr. to Mubarak Jr., Gamal, who is presently 47 years old. Since the early 2000s, and why do I say presumed succession? Because we've seen Gamal position himself to become the party's nomination, become the next president. And Mubarak Sr. has been pushing his son sort of up the ladder of the ruling National Democratic Party, and bringing in businessmen chosen by Gamal to implement economic reforms, which have taken place. Gamal is presently the party's Assistant Secretary General. In the current government under Prime Minister Ahmed Nazif, is widely viewed and called Gamal's cabinet. Gamal has been the most visible leader among the Egyptian establishment's reformers, and he's certainly well positioned to be named presidential candidate. But Mubarak Sr.'s presumed plan to pass power to his son, I think, is running into trouble. Gamal is proving to have real liabilities. There's no sign that he has the blessing of the army or the security forces. And Egypt has had military presidents since the 1952 revolution led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. There are signs the so-called old guard in the party and the bureaucracy are not enchanted with Gamal. The party has tentatively named Mubarak Sr. as its candidate for the September presidential election, although he himself has not said whether he wants to run or not. We're beginning to see other candidates mentioned, like Ahmed Shafiq, who's the Minister of Civil Aviation, and like Mubarak, former head of the Egyptian Air Force. Another military figure often mentioned is Omar Suleiman, head of the intelligence service. And finally, you have a real dark horse in Mohamed ElBaradei, the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He's put together a coalition of pro-democracy groups and the Muslim Brotherhood there to try to change the terms for participating in the presidential election. That involves changing the constitution to allow non-party independents like himself to run. So far, he's not had much success. So Mubarak Sr., I think, has two choices. He can step down now or before the presidential election and use his authority to help his son consolidate his power, well, first become president and then consolidate his power. Or he can run again and stay in power until he dies and leave Gamal to his fate. We will not hear, I don't think he'll make a decision until next July. There's a campaign period for the presidency of 60 days, so it would probably be sometime in July that Mubarak Sr. will have to decide whether he's going to run again or not. Right now, the betting is he will run again. And even though this will probably lessen Gamal's chances and increase the uncertainty about Egyptian's future leadership, should we accept disturbances? ElBaradei and the Muslim Brotherhood have already said they're going to boycott the presidential election next September, this September, and protest over how the parliamentary elections were just held in November and December, which saw the Muslim Brotherhood lose all 88 of its seats in parliament. The well-established WAFT party has withdrawn its 7 candidates who actually won seats, and the other opposition parties now hold less than a handful of seats in the new parliament. So the political scene is becoming extremely polarized, as is the social scene, which I described earlier in this tension between the Muslims and Christian Copts. I would still be surprised to see like 100,000 Egyptians going into the streets of Cairo either in support or opposition to the ruling party's presidential choice. Egyptians basically are profoundly apolitical and cynical about politics and their leaders. Even the government says only 35% of the electorate turned out for the parliamentary elections in late November and early December. The opposition says 10% or 15%. But we should expect street demonstrations of a lesser magnitude by pro-democracy and civil society groups, particularly if Gamal is anointed by his father or the ruling party. I think there's a very good chance of violent political disturbances in the offing. ElBaradei has already talked publicly about taking to the street and even engaging in acts of civil disobedience if he's shut out of the political process. After the latest parliamentary elections, here's what he said to his supporters, quote, "I hope the regime understands that if they don't allow us this," meaning political reforms to allow him to run, "the Egyptian people will be left with one choice only. There will be violence in Egypt, and that is something no Egyptian wants." Now, coming from somebody like ElBaradei, who's sedate, not a bow tie, he wears a long tie, but he's a very formal diplomat, and just the idea that he's going to organize street protest or go into the streets, to me is kind of, I'll believe it when I see it, but that's what he's saying. But I'm really more worried about the Muslim Brotherhood. It's now totally shut out of the political process, and I think this is very problematical for the government, because it is the one organization in Egypt that is capable of calling out 100,000 protesters on the streets, and probably many more than 100,000, if it so chooses. And I think the likelihood, now that they've been shut out of parliament, is that some part of the Muslim Brotherhood that has become totally disaffected with the political process will go underground, start underground activities, and I just wouldn't be surprised if their groups now split off from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and think about engaging in terrorism. We don't know who placed the bomb there, whether it's Al-Qaeda. I haven't seen the Egyptian government reaching any conclusion, whether it's Al-Qaeda trying to cause trouble between Christians and Muslims, or some offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood that's just fed up with the whole political system. Finally, I think there's a good prospect of more sectarian violence, a lot more, unless the government really brings the Christians and Muslim leaders together and makes a major effort to bring this under control. In any case, I would certainly agree that we should expect disturbances over the succession in Egypt over the coming year. And I'll stop there and go to questions.
Thank you, David. David, you mentioned just sort of like this, that Bouteflika is thinking of, or there is the rumor that his brother will succeed him. Who is this brother? We've never heard of him.
Well, Said Bouteflika has never been in politics before. He's a professional. I can't remember if he's a doctor or a teacher or both. I mean, maybe both. His supporters have organized a political party of National Concord or something like that. It's mostly coming from the eastern part of Algeria, where Bouteflika comes from. So it's kind of that, there's all this kind of regional politics in Algeria between the east and the west, and which I won't get into here in detail. But so it's not clear whether Said Bouteflika has the support of the security people or the military, which have been making and unmaking governments there since independence. So talking to Algerian journalists in December there, nobody seemed to take Said Bouteflika very seriously. But if the military and the security people decide, and that's who makes the presidents there, decides to back him, then he probably would come to power.
So this means that basically the republics in the Arab world are also moving towards
Publics
kind of,
publics are definitely looking more and more like the monarchs.
Yes. And that's, okay, we are now opening the floor. Please wait for the mic and identify yourself. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mark Katz from the Middle East Policy Council. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I'm sorry you couldn't go into all the different cases because some of these cases really are interesting. And I'm wondering if you could just comment on two, and that is Yemen. I've had the opportunity to meet both with President Saleh and his son Ahmed. And I can tell you Ahmed is not nearly the engaging personality that his father is. And of course, some would doubt that the father is so engaging. And also Oman, where an heir has not been named. Sort of a bizarre process has been set up. And I'm just wondering if you could quickly sort of assess the chances for smooth transitions in both these countries. Thank you.
Well, in the case of Yemen and Ali Saleh, I'm impressed that Ahmed, his son, is ahead of the special forces and clearly into the military security establishment, which more and more we're seeing throughout the Arab world are really called the kingmakers. They're not president makers. Yemen is in the process, or so it seems, of falling apart, although those of us who visited Yemen back in the 70s and 80s, there never was a country. It was just a collection of tribes. And when I first went there in the 70s, they were paying off the tribe at the end of the airport, the international airport, in order to assure the security of planes arriving in Sana'a. So it's never been a country. So to talk about it as a failing country, but anyway, it's got its problems. There's a incipient secession movement in the south of the country, and the Houthi, kind of a Shiite offshoot group up in the north, and Al-Qaeda roaming around the country. So, but all this would tend to make me think that they'll want somebody who is from the security apparatus, and that his son is perfectly placed to become the next president. But first, Saleh may be there for another decade if he doesn't, fall amiss to the magic bullet from an assassin. Oman is a mystery. Qaboos has never been married. He doesn't have children. They've set up this obscure process, but nobody knows how it's going to. I mean, after all, it's been 40 years. Qaboos himself ousted his father in order to take power. So Oman, I have no idea how it's going to proceed.
Yes, please.
Thank you, David. By the way, Qaboos in Arabic means nightmare. And there's another word for president kings. Saad ad-Din Ibrahim made it up. Gumhurukiya.
Yes.
Yes.
Nation of the two. My question. Okay, my name is Ibrahim Hassan. I've been reminded. I live here in Washington, D.C. I am an Egyptian American. In terms of Egypt, there are other groups like the 6th of April Movement for Change, and these are mostly young people who are really, they have loyalty or work with ElBaradei, but at the same time, I hope that they will be the basis for a change. What do you think of these other groups? Thank you.
I think they're having real problems in getting their roots into the society. One of the interesting things about Egypt is the pro-democracy reformers have been unable to link up with labor in the country. There's a lot of labor discontent and a lot of strikes, a lot of turmoil, and the labor leaders that are been involved in these protests have not wanted the pro-democracy groups to come to their aid or assistance. And the pro-democracy groups have so far not found a way to link up with the group that are really the street activists, and that's the labor, these groups that are striking in factories and holding out for months about wages. And the pro-democracy groups have not been able to establish a following in the labor group, among the laborers or among the peasantry. I don't even see them gaining a lot of support in Cairo's wealthy suburbs or among the increasingly influential business groups in the country. And so they've had to fall back on this alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood, which I'm not sure is going to work for them. ElBaradei managed to get a petition signed by more or less 1 million Egyptians, calling for a change in the constitution that would allow, among other things, that would allow him to run. 3/4 of the signatures came from the Muslim Brotherhood. So ElBaradei and the April 6 groups and the other pro-democracy groups are now tied in very much for any kind of success with the Muslim Brotherhood. And that doesn't strike me as an alliance, a happy alliance. And I don't know how ElBaradei takes his campaign to the upper class or the upper middle class when the government surely is going to say, oh, he's the candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood. Because the upper middle class and the upper class are not where the Muslim Brotherhood has much strength. So I think the pro-democracy groups have a lot of work to do to put together a credible coalition to challenge the Mubaraks for the next presidential candidate.
Henry, please.
Henry Precht. I'd like to return to the question of age, which you kind of wrote off. As we know, age has its defects, and it can be terribly hard to govern when you reach a certain point in life, past 80, I would say, which emphasizes the importance of who's devising policies. If we leave aside the question of transfer of power, how is policy going to be conducted during this continued rule of these aged gentlemen? Who's going to be calling the shots? Do you have any insights on that?
Well, you almost have to take it country by country. If you look at Egypt, you have all these economic reformers that are coming to power, and have been in power since 2004, since Ahmed Nazif became prime minister. I think Egyptians realize they got to get the economy going, and they've started doing that since 2004. The economy is finally growing. These economic reforms are having an effect, and because of the pressure, this is a country where 40% of the population is living on $2 or less. And everybody realizes they got to do something about the economic situation. So I would expect economic reformers, whether it ends up being a military candidate or a civilian candidate, the economic reformers are going to continue to be an important factor in decision-making in Egypt, which is a major change in how Egypt is run and which groups participate. In the case of Saudi Arabia, I don't know, in the case of Saudi Arabia and the king, the crown prince Sultan, he's sick and really playing no role anymore. Nayef is a conservative. And it wouldn't surprise me that there'll be some rollback on the reforms that Abdullah has tried to carry out. Naif has come out and said, what do we need elections for the Shura for? And that's the kind of national consultative assembly that is chosen. Everybody's appointed. They've never had elections for that, no. So it's clear that Naif is not going to be interested in reform. And so political reform in Saudi Arabia will probably be blocked. Economic reform, I think, will go ahead, because they're in the World Trade Organization, and they too have to create jobs. They're creating new industrial cities. Economics is very much on their mind. And but you know, in Saudi Arabia, the king and 2 or 3 people around him kind of decide how things are going to go. It's not a wide group of decision makers. But so I would expect, if Sultan's kind of conservative too, he's got the same tendencies of he's no longer a reformer. He was when he was much younger, but he's no longer a reformer. So I would expect political reforms to slow down, economic reforms to go forward in Saudi Arabia, no matter who's the next king.
Yes, please.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. In listening to you, what came to mind was, who gets to vote? And no, it strikes me, if 40% of the people are living on $2 a day, do they get to vote? And I guess it's different from country to country, but do you have an answer for us?
In Egypt, those people living on $2 a day or less do get to vote. The problem is that across the Arab world, elections are just totally rigged. They're no credible. Well, I should say in Morocco, they're still. I think they're still pretty well. They're not rigged in Morocco. The king rigs the system about what powers the government itself can have, but people do vote. But aside Morocco, I think if you had to make a generalization, it's not that people don't vote, although if you come to the Gulf and the monarchs, they don't vote. So we talk about in elections, you know, in the so-called republics, or Syria, Egypt, non-royal ruled countries. There are elections, and they're rigged. So you can vote, they allow them to vote, but it doesn't make any difference. And you see, the reaction is that people don't vote. And in Egypt, I mean, even if the government says, and I'm sure it's putting the best face on the parliamentarian elections it can, and then only 35% of the people voted, they say, and the opposition says now it's 10 or 15. It's very low. So that's the complicated answer of who gets to vote and so what.
Yes, last question, please. Microphone, please.
Bob Kopek and I have enjoyed listening to you. Why is it that these countries, whether they're republics or monarchies, seem to be willing to let sons' heredity take over from their fathers? At some point, aren't they going to say, just because you were royally born or the son of the president doesn't make you, the most qualified candidate to become the next president, prime minister?
Let's take another question here too, and David here. Yes, please, and then we get the yes for you, please. Yeah. Question, please. Yeah.
My name is John Franklin. I was a Middle East Studies major at the College of William and Mary. My question concerns, I guess, a crystal ball, if you will. If we assume that there will be at least 2 or 3 cycles of contested elections in Iraq, what impact will, assuming again that pluralistic representative system takes hold in that country, what impact will those election cycles likely have on democracy movements in some of the other Arab countries in the region?
Second question first. I think that the monarchies in the Gulf nearest to Iraq have been horrified by the experience of democracy in Iraq. They're even having a lot of problems with what's happening in Kuwait, where actually you have a parliament that can vote and has been struggling with the ruling emir and his family. So its immediate neighbors is going to strengthen their conviction that democracy is not the answer. Because what's happened in Iraq has turned power over to Shia government, and changed the balance of power for the Sunni Arab states on the other side of the Gulf. The process is a mess. Most of them think we've created another Lebanon, a confessional, you'll have a Sunni who's always there and a Kurd who's there, and it's just a version of Lebanon being created there. So it's not getting rave reviews in the Arab world, even beyond Iraq's immediate neighbors. So I think it's going to have a negative effect until until Iraq produces what's perceived to be a stable government in which all factions are participating and have some say in how the country is run. The question of why sons, why, you can go look into the history of the Ottoman Empire and how sons and brothers killed each other to come to power, is it historic tradition coming back to the Arab world? I don't know. I'm not sure it's that, but I think what happens is that you get a leader in power and then you get a group around him that are committed to him, and they see in the son a continuation of their own power, whether it's the security system or business community, or what you see is business community in most of these countries interwoven with the security and the whoever's president, and so they see their own interests served by a continuation of the person or the family they know and they've dealt with over time. That's what I think is why they're looking for sons or brothers to take over.
Please join me in thanking David Ottaway.